Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on the Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. I can imagine that. Well, good evening to everybody who joined us. I can see quite a few of our friends here, regular listeners as well, people who love asking questions, discussing the topics which Professor Stephen Nagy prepares for us. Today we're going to talk about middle powers and the geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific. There is a lot to talk about this. Of course, there are a lot of middle powers in the world. I would like to believe this, but well, of course, we're going to hear about this from Professor Nagy. This is Japan Expert Insights, and this is the bi-weekly Monday evening series with Professor Nagy. We are grateful for your joining us every time your schedule allows this. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Hi, Maya. Thanks very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. And before we start, I'd like to just take a moment to recognize what's happening in Ukraine right now and how difficult it is for the Ukrainian people, and raise a glass of wine to all those countries and people that are actively bringing in the Ukrainian refugees into their countries and helping them. This is a really important moment, I think, in how we understand global order, how we understand great power behavior. And I think it's something that we will discuss tonight as we discuss middle powers in the context of the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. But I do believe what's happening in Ukraine has real implications for this part of the world as well. So for this evening's discussion, for many of you, you might be going, what is a middle power? I would like to just briefly talk about a middle power so you get a better understanding of what a middle power is. And then I want to talk about some of the recent initiatives that I think are worth discussing in the context of the Indo-Pacific and why they've happened with middle powers coming together to try and influence the rulemaking process and protect the system that really middle powers and smaller powers benefit from. And then lastly, maybe bring in the Ukraine and talk about middle powers in the EU. What are they doing, and how this bodes well or maybe not well for this part of the world. So that's my three kind of broad objectives that I want to start today's discussion with. And I won't speak more than 15 minutes because, again, the best way to learn is for us to have dialogue and share views and share interpretations. So middle powers are quite interesting. I think traditionally we've understood middle powers, and I'll give you some examples, as the Scandinavian countries, Canada, Australia, South Korea to a certain degree, and they were seen as countries that were what we call normative. They would advocate for protecting human rights or eliminating mines or trying to protect what we call human security of countries. So the so-called the right to protect civilians in other countries from their own governments. And this was by and large the actions of middle powers in the 1980s and 1990s. But with the advent of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, I think middle powers kind of ended up in a position where they didn't know quite where they should be. And they shifted focus, they shifted tact, and they started to talk about human security related issues, protecting civilians from governments. We saw prominent middle powers advocate for the banning of landmines. And they had some, I think, real repercussions that really influenced international policy and helped many people deal with some of the human security issues. But fast forward to the past 4 or 5 years, what we've seen is middle powers have changed in nature, and we've seen a few other middle powers emerge that I think have become more prominent and active. And what we've seen, especially since the former administration in the White House, the Trump administration, we saw quite a few countries become much more proactive in the international domain, and in particular Indo-Pacific. And one of those countries is Japan. Another is Australia. Another is India. And I use these three countries as middle powers for a couple different reasons. One is the way they behave. They behave in a way that they want to support international institutions, support international law as much as possible, and they're willing to divert some of their resources to supporting those institutions. Second, and I think this is particularly in the case of Japan and India, with Japan being exceptionally rich, exceptionally technological, and it does have, on paper, the ability to do things that great powers or superpowers may want to do, and that's acquire nuclear weapons and acquire a much bigger military. But it's made an active choice not to do that, to divert its resources to diplomacy, to development, to infrastructure and connectivity, and under the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, to investing in multilateralism. And what I mean by that is, leading the comprehensive progressive trans-Pacific partnership, building a partnership with the European Union in terms of infrastructure and connectivity, signing the European Union-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, leading the Data Free Flow with Trust initiative, and of course, spearheading the Quad along with the United States, Australia, and India. So what we saw under the former Prime Minister, really Japan step up to the plate and try to fill the vacuum that I think occurred when the former President of the United States, Mr. Trump, left the TPP, really started to create more transactional America First diplomacy. And middle powers in this part of the world understood this implicitly, that they needed to step up to the plate to be more proactive, not only to protect their interests from a revisionist power in this region, that's China, but they also had to step up and protect their interests in terms of a more transactional America First foreign policy. And I think that is really a substantial difference when we think about middle power politics in the 1980s and 90s compared to what we're seeing today. So some characteristics of middle powers, what I call neo-Middlepower diplomacy, is one, they're interested in not only protecting the international system, but also in making the rules, or rule making. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in my examples, but I'm going to bring up the example of the digital economy, the maritime domain, as well as trade. Another characteristics of neo-Middlepower diplomacy, or middle power diplomacy in this region, is that some of the tools they use are not so normative. They potentially will try to insulate their economies from great powers. They'll invest in their economies for the great powers. They'll form small unilateral relationships to protect themselves from great powers. So it's a very proactive approach that's not necessarily just focused on human rights and human security, but rather a very proactive approach to the pragmatic challenges within the region. A third characteristic, and I think it's really, really important, is for us to be thinking about these new middle power diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific is not necessarily always being supported by the traditional partner of middle powers, and that's the United States. And I think we saw this in particular under the former administration in the United States, where the transactional diplomacy, American First diplomacy, sometimes the extortionist diplomacy towards some of its long-standing allies, whether it's Canada forcing the reunification of NAFTA 2.0, whether it's forcing the Japanese or trying to force the Japanese to pay much more for the burden sharing agreements between the two states, or the South Koreans, and even acerbic diplomacy towards the Australians at the beginning of the Trump administration. There was a real realization that the United States, although a critical partner, may actually harm the interests of some of the allies, these middle powers, if they're not proactive in lobbying the United States, trying to influence the United States, and trying to shape the decisions of the United States and leaders. So those are kind of three characteristics that I understand in terms of this neo-middle power diplomacy and some of their actions within this region. So what kinds of actions have we seen in the Indo-Pacific region that are typical of middle power diplomacy and why it matters? So I think one of the key examples, and I mentioned earlier, is Japan and Australia and Canada and other countries coming together to sign the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. After the United States withdrew from the original Trans-Pacific Partnership, we saw an important decision by Japan and others to say that this agreement is very critical for our future. It focuses on intellectual property rights, environmental law, labor law. It's a trade agreement that's going to shape how we think about research and development over the next 10, 20, and 30 years. Basically, it's writing the rules of trade and trying to create new trade regimes that will benefit the CPTPP partners, but also really allow them to create an environment where they can really invest in research and development so that they can create the next technologies and the next tools and the next standards for a 21st century trade agreement. And the TPP-11, and as I think many of you know today, is being enlarged. We have the UK that has lodged their application to join the TPP. Of course, we have South Korea that's also lodged their application to join the TPP, although it came after Taiwan and China. But there's growing interest in the TPP as mechanisms of standard setting. And this is very important for middle powers. They need to be part of the rules-making process. And if they're not at the table making those rules, they could be on the menu. And I think that this is a really important aspect, it's an excellent example of how middle powers have been trying to shape the economy within the Indo-Pacific region. And the leaders really are and was Japan, Australia, of course, Canada is part of this, but also the smaller Southeast Asian countries, Mexico and others that decided to join the TPP-11. Another really interesting area that I think there's growing convergence between middle powers is the digital environment, the digital economy. And here we're talking about again, Japan putting forward the so-called Data Free Flow with Trust initiative at the Osaka summit back in 2019. And this is meant to try and protect the privacy of us as digital consumers, but also, again, shape the rules and regulations of the digital economy moving forward so that the market and a rules-based system and a transparent legal system is the final arbiter of how we use the digital economy. And I think most of you are already you already understand the competition right now, or one of the competitions between the United States and China right now is really in the technology realm, in the 5G realm, in the digital economy, and trying to figure out who will be setting the rules for the digital economy in the 21st century. And this is important, and I think that it goes to how we think about privacy, how we think about the standards of the digital economy, how we think about the role of state in managing and having access to the digital economy, but also how we tax it and govern this digital economy. And importantly, and I think in the context of what's happening in Ukraine, I do think that there's an accelerated interest in countries like China watching the sanctions being put on Russia right now and cutting it off from the SWIFT system and cutting it off from hard currency, cutting its banks off from trading in internationally traded currencies, that there's a real need to create a digital economy that has a digitized yuan that is insulated from these kind of tactics moving forward. So middle powers in many ways have been trying to forge some standards in the digital economy. There's a long ways to go, but I think it's another example of where middle powers are working together within this region, but also globally, to protect their interest, to try and create the rules of the road for the digital economy moving forward, and try to focus on a free and open digital space where us as consumers have our privacy protected, but also can maximize the benefits of a digital economy. A third area that I think is really interesting moving at this particular time is looking at middle power cooperation in the maritime security domain. And you might be saying, where are the middle powers working in the maritime security domain? Well, what's interesting, we see multilateral frameworks, we see Quad Plus cooperation with middle powers in this region, and we see even unilateral action of middle powers within this region to try and provide some public good in the maritime security domain. So we can look at the so-called neon operations in the Sea of Japan. And I think many of you know back in 2017, our friends in Pyongyang were launching ICBMs over Japan and doing missile tests. And of course, they had a nuclear test in northeastern North Korea on the border of China. And this resulted in sanctions being taken by the United Nations Security Council. And we saw a group of countries come together to engage in what we call sanctions evasion activities in the Sea of Japan. And basically what we saw is Canada, the UK, France, Australia, and New Zealand working together, but rotating, to provide what we call maritime domain awareness in the Sea of Japan to ensure that the North Koreans were not evading sanctions. So I think this is a really, really interesting example of how middle powers are coming together to provide some public goods in the maritime security domain. But there's other examples where we see a plug-in concept, or what we call the quadrilateral security dialogue, a Quad Plus formation. And here back in January, we saw the Canadians plug into the Quad exercises in and around Guam to work on cooperation with other middle powers and the United States. We've seen the Quad plug into the Perouse exercises in and around India with the French back in April 2021, again showing that France as a middle power can cooperate with other organizations or minilaterals to provide some maritime security. And we've seen other examples of this so-called plugging in effect or bolt-in effect, where middle powers bolt into minilateral groupings like the Quad, or they form trilateral or bilateral partnerships to provide some public good within the region. Now, what's interesting, over the past year, we've seen the Germans come into the region. We've seen the French be more proactive within the region. We've seen our Japanese friends be much more proactive in the region. And Canadians, where I'm from, have become much more regularized in their presence within the maritime domain of the Indo-Pacific. And this suggests that middle powers understand that they need to step up to the plate, that they need to provide some public good to the region, and that public good is not necessarily just about capacities, so that sheer amount of assets they can provide to the region, but what capabilities can they provide to the region? And I think this is really important. In the case of Canada, they have exceptional intelligence gathering skills that have been honed through working through NATO. And they use those to provide maritime domainist awareness in the region, but also working with other middle powers and the United States within the region to enhance some of the maritime domain awareness in the region. So these are really good examples of how I think middle powers are coming together in the Indo-Pacific to provide some public goods and build a stronger, more coordinated presence within the Indo-Pacific. Lastly, and I think importantly, what's happening in terms of middle power coordination or cooperation in Europe, and what does it mean for this part of the world? So what we've seen over the past 12 days since this invasion of the Ukraine happened, that we've seen the United States working alongside the European Union and individual European states to put sanctions on Russia. And those financial sanctions and limits of and enhanced surveillance of Russian oligarchs really demonstrate that middle powers working together, but also working with the United States, can really enhance the amount of security and economic and financial policies that they can lend to a particular region. So right now, our Russian friends are facing a very difficult economic situation. Their athletes are being banned from participating in sports. No longer can the Russians hold sporting events. It will be difficult for Russians to travel in and out of Russia. And of course, most of their banks have been banned from the SWIFT system. So this coordinated middle power diplomacy, working with the United States, really has created, I think, an interesting example of how middle powers are cooperating to provide some public good, in this case to push back the Russians within the region and really try to stabilize what's happening in Eastern Europe and hopefully secure the regional order within the region. What this means is that I think that if there is an equivalent challenge within the Indo-Pacific region, is that we may see middle powers working together with the United States to coordinate some of their security, diplomatic, economic, and fiscal policies within the region to strangle or choke off whatever power within this region was trying to shape or reshape the region's security architecture, economic policies, and rules and regulations and standards. And I think that this is very important for us to continue to watch. Will the middle powers continue to work with the United States, and will this cooperation be sustainable? That's an open question. It's only been 12 days into this war. Will it pay dividends? And by that I mean, will it be able to push back Putin back into Russia and reestablish Ukraine as a sovereign state? This is an open question tonight. In weeks to come, we'll find out. And third, will it send strong signals to revisionist powers in this part of the world that if they try to change the region by force or try to push standards or the adoption of behavior that goes against middle powers, that they're likely to face a similar onslaught of a comprehensive set of tools to push back against revisionist powers that are challenging global order or international order. So I think those are some important talking points that we can start today's discussion with. I look forward to your questions and comments and everything you have to say about some of the initial points that I drew up today.
Stephen, while you were talking, you mentioned the United States, that the middle powers work or they collaborate with the United States, and they're trying to push back the invasion and push back Mr. Putin. But I wonder how the middle powers can actually counteract to other, because we've got two big great powers at the moment, which are not in state of war. So one of them is the United States and the other one is China. So, and you mentioned the United States, that the middle powers are cooperating with the United States, but I wonder how China is actually, or how it fits into the bigger picture.
So I think that China is a very complicated question in terms of how it thinks about its own foreign policy. I think when it looks at what's happened in Ukraine, it has placed it in a Mr. Putin has placed China in a very, very uncomfortable position based on China's five principles of peaceful coexistence. And the most important ones of those, of course, is sovereignty and not using force to change as an instrument of foreign policy. That they've been placed in a position where they're seen almost as a facilitator of Mr. Putin's actions in the Ukraine. I don't think that's quite the case, but I think that it really they've been placed in a not very good situation. Now, when we're thinking about middle powers in the context of China, and this is a real challenge, and I think one of the reasons why middle powers have become more proactive in some of their diplomacy has to do with Chinese behavior within the region. Mm-hmm. This year we saw, after the Australians called for an international investigation asked for an international investigation to discover the origins of COVID, the Chinese engaged in economic coercion. After the South Koreans installed THAAD into their system to protect them against North Korean missiles, they were a victim of economic coercion. After the Canadians arrested Meng Wanzhou, the executive for Huawei, 2 Canadians were a victim of economic coercion. And of course, Japan as well has been a victim of economic coercion and embargoes. So middle powers have basically come together and said, well, we need to think about how we can work together to push back and protect ourselves against economic coercion from China. But I should be clear, they're also thinking about this in terms of the United States. And under the Trump administration, it wasn't economic coercion in the same way as China, but it was still economic coercion from many countries' points of view. So what we're seeing is these countries coming together, forming these large multilateral agreements to insulate them and give them more choice and strategic autonomy, and to protect them from the kind of coercion that does take place by great powers. And I really want to emphasize that. It's not just China that has done this. I think that the former administration of the United States has done this as well. And I think that middle powers really have come to the conclusion that they need to find ways to protect themselves from this kind of challenge. I think Chao Ting has jumped in.
Chao Ting, yes.
Yeah, good evening, Stephen.
Hey, hi, Chao Ting.
Hi, good evening. So thank you very much for your presentation. I think you are talking about a very important issue related to the importance of middle power in face of the great power rivalry. I think we have talked about China and the US and other great powers for a long time, but probably we have ignored the importance of middle powers. But today you are emphasizing the meaning of middle powers and the roles they can play, for example, to define the rules-based international order. So I think this is really very important perspective for me. So I have one question related to middle power. I think in Indo-Pacific strategy, there are 2 approaches of international order. The first is the rules-based liberal international order created by the US. And the second is the relations-based or relations-oriented approach pursued by China. As we know, China's Belt and Road Initiative will promote connectivity, infrastructure, and other things. So China prefers relation-based approaches rather than rules-based approach. This is the difference between the US and the United States. So my question is about the attitudes and the position of middle powers towards the 2 different approaches. First, I think normally the middle powers should prefer rules-based approach because this is good for them. Because middle powers are not so powerful like great powers or superpowers. So if the world is defined by the rules, this is better for middle powers and small countries because this kind of international order can protect their interests. So But on the other hand, many middle powers in Indo-Pacific countries or small countries have no very strong, good governance. I mean, their governance is not very good. Many countries are very corrupt. Rules of law, transparency, and some others values are not respected in these countries. So, I mean, many countries are actually very corrupt. Probably they will prefer China's approach. I mean, relations-based or relations-oriented international order. So this is really a paradox. So I would like to ask you, how do you think about the two approaches, and what should be the right attitudes of middle powers towards the two different approaches? Thanks.
Thanks, Xiaoting. I think you bring up some really, really interesting points. So in my understanding, prior to World War I, foreign affairs in the European context was by and large relational. It wasn't hierarchical in this context, in the same context as I think East Asia, but it was by and large relational in that the royal families were all somewhat interrelated, and that's how they engaged in understandings and how they mitigated or prevented conflict. But of course, with World War I and World War II, we found out that the relational approach, the non-legalistic approach, where we don't bind leaders, we don't bind governments to transparent legal systems, frankly led them to a very devastating 30 years of war, or 2 wars. So the international system that was really built in the post-World War II period, its founding principles were about using international law to curb the behavior of states. And of course, domestic law, or if we go to the European Union, to create a union that will prevent, and based on a shared understanding of law, to prevent another conflict from occurring. And this is the order that I think we've enjoyed for the past 80 years. And in that context, I think that it served middle powers and small powers, and even great powers quite well, in that it created a fairly predictable set of rules and predictable behavior to protect small and middle-sized states from great powers. As I mentioned, it's an imperfect system in that great powers really can do what they want when they want, especially towards middle powers and smaller powers. But the legalistic side of a rules-based system, I think, gives countries that have rule of law, that are less corrupt, as you mentioned, I think strength and sense of confidence in a rules-based system. Now, you're right, and Qin Yaqin from Chinese Foreign Affairs University wrote the book called A Relational Theory of World Politics. I'm sure you've read it. And talks about China's relational approach to foreign affairs. And I think that relational approach does work, and it's more inclusive in many ways for various different kinds of political and cultural systems. But it is hierarchical, and I don't think it is as predictable as a rules-based system for middle powers of many different persuasions. It creates client states, it creates hierarchical relations, and in many ways, the stability that may come from a hierarchical relation may result in some kind of state sovereignty being sacrificed for that relational form of system. I think we've seen that with Cambodia. We've seen it to a certain extent with Laos. We've seen it with a certain extent with Thailand. And I think that this is a challenge in terms of long-term stability and predictability. A second point is that relationships can go sour. And, there's a very interesting example, Czechia in Europe. They were seen as one of the closest states to China a few years ago. But the relationship soured, and as a result, today the relationship is very, very, very bad. Lithuania as well, relative good relationship until they decided to change the name of the Taipei Representative Office to Taiwan Representative Office. And today, the relationship is not so good. Even Canada had a relatively good relationship with China until that relationship was politicized. So I'm not sure if the relational aspect of how China engages in foreign policy really brings confidence to middle powers. And if it is a stable system over the long term, as relationships between different countries and political systems become more entangled and the contradictions become more evident. But I'd be interested in hearing what you think.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. The rules-based order is better than relations-based order because this is, this can protect the interest of smaller countries. This is same as the domestic governance model. I think the two different approaches are the products of two different domestic governance models. In the U.S., rules of law is the basic governance model and not based on power, not based on connections. Okay, but in China, the domestic governance model is really different. You are right. I think in China, the rules of law is still not the reality, and if you have strong connections with powerful people, that means you have more opportunities, you have advantages. So that's why relation is always important in Chinese society. And this is also a long-time tradition of Chinese culture. But my question is, in many Asian countries, so they don't have rule of law either, same as China. And their traditional culture is also relation-based. So probably they are also one part of the Confucius cultural cycle. That's why probably they prefer Chinese approach. I think for countries like Japan, like South Korea, so they have rules of law. In terms of domestic governance model, of course they prefer rules-based international order. But for some poor countries, you have mentioned Cambodia, Laos, probably Malaysia, Thailand. I think Thailand is very pro-American. So for these countries, for these poor countries, probably they are more comfortable with Chinese approach. That's why I think the two approaches compete against each other in Indo-Pacific. It's too early to say that the rules-based order will win over relation-based order.
Well, what's interesting, and this is my observation, is that I think a country like South Korea and Japan and a political entity like Taiwan have figured out, they brought a stability to the political system and to their domestic society and leadership transfer through a rules-based and transparent process of power transition. And I know Japan and South Korea there are other aspects that are not so transparent, but in general, and this is why we've seen a pretty transparent process of power transition from one leader to the next through elections. And I think that this bodes well for these societies, and they've done it for a while when they were poor and corrupt, and when they're rich and less corrupt. So I'm not so sure if the argument that poor and corrupt societies may not be able to adopt a rules-based system at home and rules-based system abroad, because I think that South Korea, Japan, Taiwan are all examples of a relatively rules-based system at home and abroad. Even the Philippines, Singapore to a certain extent, although Singapore is a different kind of democracy, as we all know. So I'm not sure if we can draw a direct correlation to a preference for relational politics and poor and corrupt countries. If we look at, again, how the newly industrialized economies really brought democracy into their societies, that domestic rules-based system, and how they prefer that rules-based system internationally as well.
I just cannot help but think that yes, rules-based systems they work. They're usually preferred by many countries, but still, when we say preferred by many countries, do we talk about the population of the countries? Do we talk about the political regimes there? So I think that it's really a multi-layered question. And as Xiaoting mentioned in the beginning, there is actually quite a lot to talk about and to unpack when we talk about, of course, middle powers and democracies, because democracies are not the same depending on the culture, depending on the country, depending on the region.
I agree with that.
Yeah. Stephen, we have a question actually via the back channel. So Federico cannot talk now, and he sent me a question about Russia and the sanctions against Russia. So we have seen that part of some cultural events have been cancelled there. So events such as opera performances or different or other events. So the authors there have been called barbarians. And then Federico says, I personally think this could backfire and create a stronger sense of nationalism that supports people like Putin. What do you think? What is your view on this?
Well, I'm not a Russian expert, and I will say that up front. But my general understanding of Russia and its politics within the region and the rationale for Russia's invasion of Ukraine is based on an assumption that NATO has expanded 5 waves into what Russia understands as their sphere of influence. And as a result, as Federico said, these sanctions have been placed on Russia and Russian people. It's very hard to know what Russian people think, quite frankly, because it's an authoritarian society. It's very difficult to go into Russia and take a poll and find out, are the Russians supportive of Mr. Putin and his policies or not. As a result, I think it's a very difficult question to say, will this backfire or not? In my understanding, that there are, the true believers of the Russian propaganda, and that they will find all these penalties very punitive, and that they'll push back, and they will become more nationalistic. If we look at what's happened in China and the criticisms that China has received from the West, and not just the West, but many countries, they've become extremely nationalistic, and they not so self-reflective in the problems at home that are creating these issues. That will probably occur. But there's others in Russian society, and I speak to many people in the scholarly world in Russia, and of course in the media, and they've written to me privately, and they say, well, we call this a war, and we can't talk about it anymore, we can't write about it anymore, and we don't have a place to express these views anymore. So I don't think it's so easy to say that all the Russians could be turned towards nationalism. Likely we'll see some that will, really be quiet and maybe angry about what's happening. Others may be supportive, and others may use this as leverage to push back against the government in Russia to try to change things domestically. And they could do this through transnational networks, through many different opportunities that I think will gradually emerge.
Right. So you mentioned nationalism. Of course, that was part of Federico's question. And one trend which I believe we have noticed past 2 years has been stronger nationalism, not only in great powers, but also in middle powers in smaller countries. So the pandemic has actually created an environment where people feel more protective of their own countries and their economies, their ideological systems. So I think that while we do need to worry about an increased nationalistic movement and feelings in Russia, maybe we need to think about such feelings in the rest of, in other parts of the world as well.
Absolutely. I think that there's, in this region, and I'd like to always go back to this region because this room is all about the Indo-Pacific. There's some middle powers that have real problems cooperating with each other. And, the two that I'm thinking about is, of course, is Japan and South Korea. If you look from afar, very similar societies, very similar value sets, very hierarchical, similar kind of industrial bases, a lot of similarities. Of course, they're different. But, they're both arguably middle powers. They both have an interest in many of the issues that I mentioned, whether it's maritime security, trade, the digital economy, and other areas. But they're not cooperating very well because of, I think, nationalism and a politicized history. So I think that this is something that we need to be wary of. And COVID-19 has amplified nationalism, where many countries feel that COVID is a problem that's come from the outside. And when we don't engage in, if they close their borders and they focus on their national entities, that they'll be safer from COVID. So I think definitely COVID-19 has amplified this, but in different parts of the region, nationalism is still very, very strong. And in this region, many countries are still in a process of nation building. And if you think about South and North Korea, this is a divided peninsula. They used to be part of the same political entity. China and Taiwan are split. Vietnam came out of a war 40 years ago, and now it's building a single identity. The Philippines is a new country. It's building its national identity. In this region, there's a lot of nationalism because they were released from colonialism, and they're trying to rebuild a idealized national identity. And that comes from being different from others in the region. And it creates problems for them in terms of cooperating as middle powers, especially if there are competitors like Korea and Japan.
Yes, that is an important perspective. Thank you for answering the question of Federico. And of course, we had a question from Hiroaki about the US-China rapprochement. So a possibility of this, in terms of, let's say, rapprochement of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And also, he mentioned that China has offered mediation so that the conflict can be resolved probably soon. But this is more of a comment, I believe, not so much of a question.
So with regards to China's role in some kind of mediator position between Ukraine and Russia,
yes,
in some ways there's a possibility. Russia imports a lot of Ukrainian corn and wheat, and it has a Belt Road Initiative project there. And of course, China is very close to Russia in terms of its partnership in balancing the United States. So perhaps there's a role, but I think, again, it goes back to my point that I think China, unfortunately, and in some ways it's probably true, is seen as having facilitated the invasion of Russia by welcoming Mr. Putin to the Winter Olympics opening ceremony, signing a document, apparently passing on American intelligence information to Russian counterparts about how the Americans understood the Russians' position in the Ukraine. So I don't know if they are in a particular position to mediate. And that'll be a challenge.
And the question is whether China is willing to do that, actually, because there hasn't been much news, or if any news, about China's readiness to mediate.
Well, I think that it definitely will do it if there's an opportunity where it can use that. This is an opportunity to promote China's position and usher in some goodwill globally. But I just don't know if it's actually possible, considering again that Russia and China are quite tight. They're both authoritarian systems, and that China is not at this particular stage seen as a fair partner in not outwardly and explicitly criticizing the invasion.
As you said in the beginning, it's really difficult to read the future, so especially we cannot say what will happen tomorrow or the day after. But I'm sure that everybody hopes for soon a solution of the conflict and then exit from the crisis.
Well, there's an interesting topic to be thinking about in terms of middle powers in the region, and is to think about countries like Indonesia and Vietnam. They're very big in terms of population, but they're emerging states. Do they have a role in working with other middle powers like Japan or Australia, or do they fit in a different kind of category? Vietnam is a socialist state. Indonesia is an emerging democracy. But in 20 years from now, Indonesia will have 600 million people. The economy will be much bigger. It'll dominate the region. So there's some really interesting questions when we think about middle powers within this region. Who will be a middle power in the next 10 or 20 years, and who won't be? As Japan and South Korea become smaller, maybe their role as middle powers will become smaller as well. And that's something really interesting to think about.
Many of those countries which are set to grow their power, they are creating that now. So I believe that we live in fascinating times too. Han?
I have a question for Dr. Nagy about, the kind of cooperation we have seen between middle powers in the Indo-Pacific. Like, do you see any prospect of them, those kind of cooperation, have any prospect to evolve into some kind of long-term institutional arrangement? Like, for example, cooperation in supply chains, or protecting sensitive technology from protecting sensitive technology. Something. Thank you.
Thanks, Han. I hope you're feeling better.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really feeling better now. Thank you. It's been quite a very busy week.
Okay. So I think that's a great question. And when we look at some long-term initiatives that I think middle powers are already working with, there's something called the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative that I know you know about, but others may not, where India, Japan, and Australia have decided to come together and fund some supply chains or diversification of some supply chains through Southeast Asia and South Asia. So I think that will have legs. I think that it will be long-term cooperation. But I think that eventually what we're going to likely see is an expansion of the number of partners um, in that kind of initiative. And the partnerships could come from Europe. So we could see the European Union work as one, or some of the countries like the Germany or Denmark or um, France decide to provide some infrastructure connectivity cooperation, either with Japan or with this Resilient Supply Chain Initiative, but have a more regional focus. So west of the Indian Ocean, where they're a little bit closer. And then we could see some other initiatives like France and Australia and maybe New Zealand, Canada and Japan do some infrastructure connectivity cooperation in the Pacific Islands. So I think that rather than a broad broad set of partnerships, we'll probably see a regionally specific partnership formula, and that regionally specific middle power population formula will try to provide the specific public goods that that region needs. In terms of technology, well, we see some cooperation within the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. At the March 2021 meeting and then the September 2021 meeting in Washington, the leaders came together and said we're going to cooperate in certain levels of technology, 5G, standard setting. But of course, that includes the United States. So that we see three middle powers cooperating with the United States. And when it does that, it has more sustaining power. It'll be interesting to see how other countries add to that. And I think we just don't know at this particular stage where they'll be. I think another area to look at is where Japan and the EU are going to be in terms of cooperation, and maybe Gabor will have something to say about this. But they already have a platform for cooperation, but where are the concrete projects? And that's something that I think we need to think about a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Gabor.
Yeah. My question is, you talked about middle power diplomacy, and from that sense, how do you see the European Union? Is the EU middle power or a little more, or how do you put the EU in that context? Because the EU is not a military power, but very strong on rules making and standard setting, and I think it showed some muscle or strength during the war, the Ukrainian war. So how do you see the role of the EU in this context?
So this is a really, it's a good question. This is one of the problems when we're talking about middle powers, because I think that we look at this definition of middle power, and I gave you some examples of what they do. But if we look at the European Union, in terms of its economy, it's definitely a great power, right? It's the biggest economic grouping in the world. It's bigger than the United States. It's bigger than China. But outside that economic union, the European Union doesn't function that well, right, in terms of foreign policy. And if we're looking at its reactions towards Ukraine, we're already seeing, I think, stress in terms of not adopting a no-fly zone over Ukraine, providing arms to the Ukrainians. There's growing, I think, worries about that, coordination on refugee issues. So I think that the European Union is definitely a middle power on a lot of areas, and it can potentially be a much more influential power in terms of the economy. So when I think about the European Union, I'm thinking about it as a middle power that can bring some capabilities to the region, some capacities, and some specific skills. So the European Union is really good at regulation, environmental policy, institution building, absolutely. And this is all stuff that, if you look at the European Union Indo-Pacific strategy, even the German Indo-Pacific guidelines, the Denmark guidelines, they talk about this. The importance of institution building in the Indo-Pacific, working with other like-minded countries to create institutions within this region that will build more transparency, build more rules-based processes within the region. And I think this is where they will lend a lot of value in terms of middle power cooperation within this region. The question for us right now is how distracted will they be from that in the Indo-Pacific as this conflict in the Ukraine continues. And we don't know. at this stage. It's 12 days into this invasion. But likely we're going to see Europe focus a lot of its resources, financial resources and economic resources, try to deal with the challenge in Ukraine. But that's a great question. Thank everybody for joining tonight. It's really great to hear your views. Gabor, Han, and Chao-Ting for your questions and insights. Maya for hosting. And again, let's have a few thoughts for all those people in Ukraine that are not so fortunate to be listening to Clubhouse tonight from a warm bed.
Well, again, thank you very much to you, everybody who joined us today here on Clubhouse. Well, we're looking forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. Stephen, thank you very much indeed for today's session.
Thank you. Look forward
Thank
to
you.
Thank you, Stephen. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.